The lamp in the kitchen flickered one last time. Outside, the rain had turned the porch steps slick. But I didn't slip. Not this time. I placed the old leather satchel by the door. Everything I truly needed. Already inside. Just clothes, some letters, and a tin of tea leaves. But the most important thing I left behind wasn't a note. Wasn't a goodbye. It was a wooden keychain. Small, smooth from years of holding. Engraved, faintly, with a sentence they never noticed. Freedom is the quietest kind of joy. I set it gently on the kitchen table, next to the untouched coffee mug. My son left this morning. He didn't look at me when he walked out. He rarely did these days. The house used to smell like cinnamon and old books. Now it just smelled empty. I took one last look at the hallway. The wedding photo was gone from the wall, replaced by something modern abstract. Cold. I couldn't even tell what it was supposed to be. Maybe that's how they saw me now. Undefined, inconvenient, in the way. They never said it outright. They didn't have to. First, my emerald teapot was boxed up, because it cluttered the counter. Then my knitting basket disappeared from the living room. And the guests stopped asking for me, because my son would always answer. She's resting. I learned to rest very well. In silence. So well. They thought I had nowhere to go. But I did. I had a plan. One that began a long time ago. Back when Harold and I dreamed of growing old. Somewhere, the world couldn't find us. That place still existed. And I still had the key. So I turned off the lamp. Stepped out into the soft, forgiving dark. And closed the door behind me. Without a sound. The lock clicked. But for once, it wasn't locking me out. It was locking them in. To the life they chose. Without me. What if dignity means walking away before they tell you to go? The cabin door creaked open as I stepped into the warmth. But it wasn't the first time I'd imagined this place. In truth, I had lived here many times before. In my mind. Back then, Harold used to draw sketches of this very cabin. On napkins at the diner after Sunday service. He'd talk about building a porch with a view of the trees. I used to laugh and say, "We already have a porch, Harold." And he'd smile, like he knew something I didn't. Maybe he did. The cabin smelled of pine, old flannel, and a hint of smoke. The rain tapped gently on the tin roof. Steady, familiar. I lit the wood stove the way Harold showed me years ago. 2 pine cones, kindling crisscrossed. And just a whisper of breath. Flames came to life like they were waiting for me. I hung my shawl on the old hook near the door. The same one Harold carved with his penknife. It still had his initials, H.M. etched like a quiet vow. No one else ever heard. I didn't cry. I just sat. The chair by the fire still rocked with that old creak. That tender protest of age. I had grown to love more than silence. I wrapped the wool blanket around my legs. The one with frayed corners. From decades of winters. Everything in this place felt like it remembered me. And for once, I didn't feel like I had to explain why I was there. There was no voice asking what I planned to cook, or if I had remembered to move my things out of the way. Just breath and wood and rain. I made tea. Not the bagged kind from the pantry back home, but the loose leaf Harold and I used to keep. In a tin marked Sundays only. A mix of cinnamon and dried orange peel. He used to say it smelled like warm light. I poured the water. Watched the steam rise and curl. As if it carried whispers. From all the versions of me I had packed away over the years. In that moment, I didn't miss my old house. What I missed was the woman I used to be. Before they made her smaller. In her own kitchen. And somewhere between the steam and the rocking chair, I remembered her. She was still here. Waiting. I used to love Saturdays. Back then, I'd walk to the corner market. With Harold's old basket in hand. We always stopped by Miss Alma's for peaches. Then back home to bake. The smell of cinnamon would drift from our window down the hill. and neighbors would stop by, just to ask what was in the oven. That house. It wasn't grand, but it held warmth in its bones. Now, the market's been turned into a pharmacy. Miss Alma passed 5 summers ago. And when I baked last spring, my daughter-in-law opened a window. Because it smells too strong. She didn't mean it cruelly, but it landed somewhere deep. Like I was seasoning the air. With memories no one had room for anymore. In the hallway, they hung a new mirror, sleek, frameless. The frame Harold carved from driftwood was put in the garage. My face used to smile back at me from the old mirror. This one, I just reflected how tired I looked. In someone else's home. I tried to keep things gentle, tried not to disturb the quiet. But it wasn't really quiet. It was distance. The kind that settles between people. When they stop asking how your day went. Even the sofa had changed. The one with the crocheted cover I made years ago was donated without asking. It was falling apart, my son said. So was I. But no one offered to carry me out with care. He meant well. He always has. But he's learned to choose convenience over connection. And I've learned to stop needing what won't be offered freely. One afternoon, I found my knitting needles packed into a box. Marked seasonal. As if my hands only mattered. In winter, I stood over that box. Longer than I should have. Ran my fingers across the yarn. Still soft. Still warm. Still mine. But I didn't take them back. I closed the box and placed it in the hallway closet, right next to the donation bin. That night, I sat in the kitchen with my tea. The window above the sink was bare. No curtains. No light. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew then. They were preparing the house for a life that didn't include me. And they thought I didn't notice. But I did. The day I knew for certain. It wasn't anything big. No slammed doors. No harsh words. It was a Tuesday. Cloudy. Quiet. I was dusting the bookshelf in the den. My fingers lingering over the titles. Harold and I used to read aloud on winter nights. But most of them were gone. In their place, rows of new hardcovers with matte jackets. Titles I didn't recognize. Spines uncreased, untouched. I opened a cabinet below, hoping. But the old ones weren't there either. Just a scented candle. And a bowl of decorative stones. Not even a single page left. I stood there with my hands still resting. On the empty shelf. As if the books might return if I waited long enough. Later that evening, my daughter-in-law came into the den. She smiled. The kind of smile that asks for agreement. Before you even know what's being asked. We're thinking of repainting this room, she said. Lighter tones. More open. I nodded. But something in me dimmed. Like one of those low-watt bulbs. Flickering before it gives up. At dinner, they talked about converting the guest room into an office. Then the back porch. Turning it into a sunroom for their plants. No one asked where I might go. Once the space had all been reimagined. Maybe they assumed I'd shrink to fit. Or fade. Like old wallpaper under fresh paint. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. The one they hadn't touched. Inside, wrapped in a cloth napkin, was the rental contract. Still folded. Still valid. Cabin 3, Blue Ridge, Hollow. Harold's name was listed beside mine. He never got to use it. But he always said, one day, you might need a place that's only yours. He was right. And I was nearly ready. Almost. I placed the contract back into the napkin. Then into the drawer. Careful. Like tucking in something fragile. That was finally beginning to breathe again. In the morning, they spoke about new curtains. New rugs. A new season. I stirred my tea. And said nothing. But in my heart, the door had already begun to open. When the world starts rearranging itself around you, will you stay still? Or find a door they forgot to lock? Sunday morning came with the smell of bacon. Not mine. I hadn't been asked to cook. Not even to brew the coffee. They moved through the kitchen like a team. She at the stove. He setting plates. Their rhythm so practiced. It no longer made room for a third. I watched from the hallway. Just out of view. The edge of the wall had become my usual seat. Laughter spilled into the dining room. Their friends had arrived. A young couple. And a little girl with wild curls. Who clutched a stuffed rabbit. And ran circles around the table. They never saw me. Or if they did. They looked through me. Like one looks through a window. Without noticing the glass. I waited for my son to say something. Mom, come join us. Pull up a chair. Anything. But his voice never reached me. He was too busy telling stories. About how he remodeled the backyard. How his wife had impeccable taste. How peaceful life had become. Since the house felt more streamlined. Streamlined. I glanced toward the entryway mirror. The crocheted wreath I'd made last fall was no longer hanging. Streamlined, indeed. A toast was made. They raised glasses of orange juice. And laughed about new beginnings. And I stood. In my old house slippers. Clutching a folded dish towel. Like a misplaced prop. From a play that no longer needed me. The worst part wasn't being forgotten. It was knowing that. Somewhere along the way. I had agreed to disappear. By staying quiet. By making space. By never asking to be seen. I stepped back into the kitchen. Just as they passed around muffins. My daughter-in-law noticed me. Offered a smile. Polite, brief, practiced. We didn't want to overwhelm you, she said. Like I was something fragile. That might break if included. I nodded. It was easier than explaining. That being left out hurts far more than being overwhelmed. I turned to refill my cup of tea. The pot was cold. And there were no clean mugs left. So I rinsed one from the sink. The water ran hot. But my hands felt colder than ever. And from the other room, their voices rose again. Sweet and full. The kind you hum along to. Once the words no longer belong to you. That evening, I walked down the hallway. And stopped where the old photo used to hang. The one of our family trip to Blowing Rock. Harold, in his corduroy jacket. His arm around me. Our son, maybe 10 then. Grinning with a gap-toothed smile. Holding a maple leaf the size of his face. But the wall was bare now. In its place, hung a canvas print. Soft gray brushstrokes. Something abstract and muted. No frame. No faces. Just space. I stood there longer than I should have. My fingers tracing the faint outline. Where the photo had once rested. There was still a slight difference in paint color. A ghost of what had been. I asked about it later, gently. Oh, that? My daughter-in-law didn't look up from her tablet. We're refreshing the hallway. Minimalist vibe. She sipped her tea. Your old frame was a bit heavy. Heavy. I smiled, barely. But the words stuck to me like lint. Too heavy. Too old. Too sentimental. And yet I carried every memory in that frame. The way a tree carries its rings. Quietly, without asking permission. It wasn't just the photo. One by one. My memories were being folded away. The Afghan on the couch? Donated. The ceramic clock in the kitchen? Didn't match the new backsplash. Even the wind chimes Harold gave me. The ones that used to sing every time the door opened. Put in the garage for safekeeping. Safe. Keeping. Words used like cotton. To wrap around things they didn't want to feel guilty about. But guilt never entered the room. Only silence did. And I was the silence. I became a quiet fixture. The resting elder. As my son once called me. In a phone call he thought I didn't hear. She likes her routines, he said. She's peaceful. No. I was careful. There's a difference. Peace comes when you're free. Carefulness comes when you're tolerated. Some nights, they'd watch movies in the den, laughing at inside jokes. I'd sit in my room with the lamp on, reading cookbooks I already knew by heart, pretending I preferred it that way. They never asked if I wanted to join, and I stopped waiting to be asked. The more I faded, the less they noticed, and I began to wonder, when exactly did I stop being someone they thought of as home? It was my birthday. Nothing grand. I hadn't expected cake or candles. At 70, you learn to lower the volume on your own wants. But still, I thought there might be a card, a word, something small. Instead, they left early. A brunch invitation, a friend's housewarming they couldn't miss. My son mentioned it in passing, like telling me he'd be 5 minutes late from work. "We won't be long," he said, putting on his shoes. I stood in the doorway, hands tucked inside my cardigan sleeves. "Do you want me to come?" I asked. He paused, one foot halfway in his sneaker. A beat too long. Then a polite laugh. "Oh, it's mostly their crowd. You'd be bored, Mom." Bored. That word again. The polite cousin of unwanted. I nodded. Of course. No reason to complicate things. They left before 10. The silence afterward felt like static on an empty channel. The kind that hums, just loud enough to remind you no one is speaking. I made myself eggs, burnt the toast, ate standing at the sink. Later, I heard the garage door open. They were back. Voices light, cheerful. I didn't go out to greet them. Instead, I stayed in my room, folding laundry that didn't need folding. I wasn't angry. That would have made me visible. I was just still, like a book no one picks up anymore, but doesn't have the heart to throw away. That night, they brought me a slice of cake from the brunch. On a paper plate. Plastic fork on top. Still cold from the fridge. Vanilla. Your favorite, right? I smiled. Took the plate. Said thank you. I waited until they went to bed to throw it out. I didn't want them to think I was ungrateful. I wasn't. Not really. Just tired of being an afterthought in the life I once held together, with casseroles and lullabies. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark a moment longer than I needed to, long enough to hear the echo of my own breath and remember how quiet this house used to be before silence became a boundary. And then I asked myself, not with bitterness, but with the calm curiosity of someone who's finally ready to see the truth. If no one notices when you're not at the table anymore, were you ever truly welcome there to begin with? The envelope wasn't meant for me. It arrived tucked between junk mail, coupons, a pizza flyer, and a thin white letter from the bank, with my name still on it. Just mine. I hadn't seen that in a while. Most things now came addressed to the Monroe household, as if I'd been folded into the wallpaper. Part of the structure, but not the story. I opened it carefully, hands steady, heart less so. The letter was polite. Always polite. Notice of cosigner change. Account access update. Primary holder. Thomas Monroe. Thomas. My son. My name was still listed, but below his, like a guest. A placeholder. I read the lines again. Slowly. As if comprehension depended on the rhythm of my breathing. There was no mistake. It wasn't a joint account anymore. Not truly. He had made himself the anchor. I was now the footnote. I set the letter down, smoothed the tablecloth beneath it, watching how the paper creased the woven cotton. Like it didn't belong. I wanted to believe there was an explanation. A good reason. So I waited. That evening, while he stood at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone, I asked, "Did something change with the bank?" He didn't look up. Just nodded. "Oh yeah. Just some tax stuff. Makes things easier. Easier. That word, again. Worn smooth like a coin passed hand to hand. Never examined too closely. It's all still there, he added, finally glancing my way. No need to worry, Mom. No need to worry. I didn't ask permission to feel what I felt. Didn't argue. I just nodded. And said, okay. Because what else do you say? When the person you once taught to hold a spoon now rearranges your life with a signature you never saw? I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, tracing its cracks, like fault lines beneath a quiet disaster. It wasn't about the money. It was about how easily a person's name can be shifted down a form, how simply they can be rearranged out of their own life, without a single raised voice. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was precise, effortless, polite, and that made it hurt far more. The next morning, I opened the file box in my closet. It hadn't been touched in years. Mostly papers, Harold and I kept crop tea. Birth certificates, old tax returns. The deed to the house. Our house. The folder was still labeled in his handwriting. Monroe. Home documents. I took it to the kitchen table and opened it beside my tea. The deed was still there. Still had both our names. But paper fades. I flipped to the last page. The updated one. Printed after Harold passed. There it was. Ownership, pending reassignment upon sale or transfer. A note in newer ink. Power of attorney. Thomas Monroe. I blinked. I didn't remember signing anything. I would have remembered. But maybe it was one of those documents he handed me last spring, when he said, just some bank stuff. Routine. I'll fill most of it out for you. He had smiled. Warm. Reassuring. And I had trusted him. Because that's what mothers do. Long after they probably shouldn't. I put the deed back in the folder. And stared out the window for a long time. The yard was quiet. Maple leaves turning early this year. Shades of rust, and copper. And something tender. I remembered Harold planting those trees. He said they'd be our legacy canopy. Now they were just shade. For someone else's future. Later that day, I opened the drawer in the hallway table. The one where we used to keep emergency cash. It was empty. I hadn't checked in months. But I used to place bills there every few weeks. Just in case. I asked my daughter-in-law about it. When she passed through the hallway. Oh, we used that for the new water heater. She said, cheerful. Like it had been a shared decision. We figured it was better than just letting it sit. Just letting it sit. Like the teapot. Like my knitting. Like me. I nodded. My tea had gone cold by then. I poured it out slowly. Watching the brown swirl vanish down the drain. Like something no longer needed. Only tolerated. Until it made room for something more useful. And in that moment, I finally understood. They weren't stealing from me. They were simply replacing me. Efficiently. Quietly. With clean hands. And tidy paperwork. That night, I sat with Harold's letters. The ones he wrote from his Navy post in '67. All folded tight. Edges browned like tea-stained truths. He always signed them. To my Della, keeper of all things that matter. I used to think that meant recipes. Photo albums. Birthdays remembered. But now I saw it differently. Maybe he meant dignity. Maybe he meant this very moment. When what mattered. I was no longer being asked for permission. In the life you still legally lived in. I pulled out the insurance binder next. Just to check. The policy had changed. Again. The primary contact was now my son. My number had been crossed out in pen. Replaced with theirs. In ink. Not a call. Not a question. Not even a passing mention. In the kitchen. Over coffee. I searched the pages for my handwriting. Found it years ago. still looped and careful. Next to the words, beneficiary, Della Monroe. But beneath it now was a newer form. Typed. Clean. The beneficiary line was blank. Empty. A future waiting to be filled by someone else. Or no one at all. It wasn't just about money. It never had been. It was about being erased so neatly. You almost thanked them for it. About being handled instead of heard. About signatures added to lines you didn't even see. I sat there for a long time, my fingers resting on the folder's spine, like it was a bone from some forgotten animal. A thing once strong, now filed away. From the other room, laughter echoed. A movie, probably. Some new comedy with jokes I wouldn't get. I didn't want to join. Not out of pride, but because I finally realized they weren't laughing with me. They were living without me. And I had let them. By not asking. By not watching closely enough. By thinking love and legality were the same thing. I stood up. Turned off the light. Left the folder open on the table. Like a question they'd never answer. And I thought. Not in bitterness, but in eerie, crystalline clarity. If your name is no longer on the things you built, is it still your home? Or just a place where you happen to sleep? The guest room smelled like lemon cleaner and fabric softener. Too clean. Too unfamiliar. Like a space prepared for someone who wouldn't stay long. I had moved into it on my own. The back pain had flared again. My daughter-in-law suggested I try the firmer mattress. Said it would help my posture. Said I might sleep better away from the hallway. I knew what she meant. Less in the way. Less to trip over. Less visible. So I packed my things. Just a few sweaters. My Bible. A tea tin Harold had given me. With a dent on the lid. No one helped. No one objected. The hallway was quiet. But not the kind that soothes. The kind that watches. The kind that waits. For you to excuse yourself. Before anyone has to ask. I folded the sweater slowly. Pressing down the sleeves. Like I was trying to smooth over a wrinkle that didn't belong to the fabric. But to my life. The hallway light stayed on. While I walked. Carrying my own pillow. Like a woman retreating from a war. No one admitted was happening. I made the bed myself. Tucked in the corners like Mama taught me. Sat at the edge. And looked out the window. Into the dark yard. I once called mine. The porch light flickered. The swing we built had been taken down last fall. They said it was weather-worn. So was I. No one had thought to store it. I ran my hand across the windowsill. Faint traces of dust. A cobweb in the corner. It hadn't been cleaned with care. Just wiped enough to make it look like it was waiting. But not for me. I took my tea beside the radiator. It hissed quietly, as if in conversation with the ache in my bones. This wasn't my room. It wasn't even a room I'd lived in. It was a space between what I'd lost and what I hadn't yet named. I pulled the blanket tighter. The one they gave me from the linen closet. It didn't smell like cedar or wool or sun. It smelled like nothing. Like absence. That night, I lay awake, counting the seconds between the creaks in the walls. I thought of Harold. How he used to read aloud. To help me fall asleep. How he used to whisper. You're not alone. I'm here. But now, the silence stretched. Not sharp. Just wide. Like a river. I didn't remember stepping into. And suddenly, I wondered. Had I made this too easy for them? Had I taught them that I was the kind of woman who would smile through the slow unraveling of everything she had built? Had I convinced them I didn't mind being moved, like a chair, to a quieter corner? I pressed my hand flat to my chest, right over the soft thud of my heart. Still there. Still steady. But quieter now. As if even it was learning to take up less space. By dawn, I hadn't slept. I moved from the bed to the chair by the window, pulled the curtain back just enough to see the yard. A squirrel ran across the fence, its tail flicking like a match. Beyond that, just gray sky and the slow stir of morning. The world was beginning again, but I wasn't in it. I sat there for a long time, long enough to hear the radiator click off, long enough to feel my hands stiffen in my lap. I used to start my mornings with purpose. Feeding the birds, opening the kitchen window to let the sun in, writing grocery lists in my looping cursive. But that morning, I didn't make a list. I didn't move. My legs felt heavier than usual. Not with age, but with something deeper. The weight of not belonging. When I did rise, I walked to the bathroom and caught my reflection in the mirror. It startled me. Not the lines. Not the gray. Those I knew. It was the stillness. The absence. The look of someone who had begun to vanish from her own eyes. I reached up to smooth my hair, but stopped halfway. What was the point of straightening what no one noticed? I touched the glass. Cool. Unforgiving. Behind me, the hallway was quiet. From downstairs, I could hear the clink of plates, the soft hum of a television. I waited, just to see if someone would call my name. They didn't. I walked back to the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the drawer beside me. Inside was a small notebook. I had placed it there weeks ago, hoping to jot down recipes or quotes from the books I used to read. It was empty. I ran my fingers over the first page, then the second. Blank. Like days waiting to be lived by someone else. I tried to remember the last time someone asked me a real question. Not, did you take your pills? Not, do you want toast? A real question. One with weight. What are you thinking about, Mom? Do you miss him? What do you want to do today? Want. That word. Desire had left me so quietly. I hadn't noticed it was gone until I realized I no longer answered to it. My life had become a series of small nods. Polite exits. Rooms left quietly, so others could speak more freely. I stood again. Looked around the room. It had all the makings of comfort. Pillows, a lamp, a window with sheer curtains. But it wasn't mine. It never had been. And in that moment, something inside me went still. Not broken. Just finished. Like a song that had played a few verses too long. And then a thought rose. Soft, but firm. A woman can lose her place in a house, her name on a paper, even her voice at the table. But what happens when she loses her place inside herself? The cupboard above the stove still creaked. That morning, I opened it out of habit, expecting to see the old jar of cinnamon sticks Harold used to hide behind the flour. But it was empty. Just rows of labeled containers. Chia seeds, flax, oat milk powder. Neat, sterile, unlived. I stood there, one hand resting on the door, waiting for something I couldn't name. A smell. A sound. A reason to still be standing. That's when I saw it. Tucked behind the spice rack, pushed deep into the corner. A small, silver tin, with a faded floral print. I pulled it down slowly, as if it might crumble from the memory. The lid stuck. I had to twist harder than I expected. Inside, scraps of paper, handwritten notes, recipes, grocery lists, a pressed maple leaf, all in my handwriting. Years of it. I ran my fingers over the ink. The swooping loops of my capital Ds. The way I dotted my I's with tiny dashes. So much of myself, preserved in flour, dust, and cinnamon. At the bottom was a torn envelope. Harold's handwriting. It wasn't a letter. Just a phrase he must have scribbled on instinct. Your stillness is not weakness. I sat down on the kitchen stool. held the tin against my chest. Like it was a heartbeat I'd forgotten how to listen to. For months, maybe longer, I had measured my worth by how little space I took up, by how quietly I moved, how rarely I disagreed, how much I didn't ask for. I told myself silence was grace, but really, it was a permission slip for them to stop looking, and I had signed it. Willingly. Daily. In small ways. Folding towels without being asked. Clearing my own plate. Before dinner had even ended. Pretending I wasn't cold. When they opened all the windows in spring. Tiny erasures. None malicious. All effective. But there. In that moment. With cinnamon in the air. And ink on my hands. I remembered who I used to be. The woman who ran church bake sales. Who helped 3 neighbors through chemo. Without ever needing thanks. Who once stood on a folding chair. To fight for better funding. For the library she worked in. I was never loud. But I was never small. Not until I let them make me so. And that realization settled inside me. Like warm bread rising. Not rage. Not grief. Just something steady. A kind of weight I was finally willing to carry again. A reminder that I had been somebody. Long before anyone called me Mom. Or a little forgetful. And I could be her again. Quietly. Carefully. But completely. I hadn't stepped into the garden in weeks. Maybe months. It used to be my sanctuary. Tomatoes along the fence. Basil near the kitchen wall. Dahlias blooming too wildly. For my daughter-in-law's taste. This place needs structure, she once said. Pulling weeds with a gloved hand. Like she was removing clutter from a closet. That was the last time I touched the soil. But that afternoon, with the tin still sitting open on the kitchen table, I walked out barefoot. The grass was uneven. Rough in places. Soggy in others. It had rained the night before. The earth gave just enough. Under my heel. To remind me it was still alive. So was I. The rosemary bush near the gate had survived the winter. Barely. Its branches brittle. Half of it bent inward like a wounded thing. I knelt beside it, pressing my palm against the base. It still smelled like Harold's favorite roast. He used to clip sprigs and tuck them under the meat, laughing as he'd say, "Don't tell the butcher. He'll charge extra for the aroma." I smiled, then reached for the pruning shears, hanging on the rusted nail by the shed. They hadn't been touched. The handles were stiff, but they still opened with effort. One by one, I clipped the broken branches. Not too much. Just enough to let light in again. The kind of trimming that says, "I'm not giving up on you yet." I moved slowly along the fence, pulling dead leaves from the tomato stakes, dusting off the terracotta pots that used to hold sage and lavender. My hands knew what to do, even if the rest of me had forgotten. Under my fingernails, soil collected, dark and cool. It smelled like 1987. The summer we planted zinnias and lost the dog for 3 days. Before he came back, covered in burrs and completely unrepentant. That soil held more of me than any document ever would. When I stood, my knees cracked. But I didn't mind. I brushed my palms on my skirt, left dirt smudges on the hem, didn't bother to wipe them off. It felt good to be marked by something that couldn't be filed away, or reassigned, or signed over. When I walked back inside, they were both in the living room, watching something on mute. No one asked where I'd been, but I didn't need them to, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't lost. I was planting myself back in. That night, I stayed up after they went to bed. The house was still. No television hum. No footsteps overhead. No cautious voices asking if I needed anything. I lit the lamp by the window, poured myself a cup of tea, and stirred in a spoonful of honey. From the old mason jar I kept hidden behind the vinegar. It tasted like late summer. Thick, golden, slow. Like something that didn't need to be rushed. To be worth keeping. On the table sat the small notebook I had placed in the guest room drawer weeks ago. Still blank. Still waiting. I opened it. Smoothed the page. Let my pen hover for a moment. Then wrote. I am still here. 3 words. Simple. Quiet. Undeniable. The ink soaked into the paper. Like rain into dry earth. I didn't stop there. I wrote down the names of all the people I used to bake for. The women from church. The neighbor who lost her son. The girl who came to me for college forms. Because her own mother never had the time. And then I wrote down the things I'd stopped saying out loud. Like, I miss being asked what I think. I miss laughing during dinner. I miss my own voice. Unfiltered. And beneath that, I still have things to give. When I closed the notebook, my hands felt steadier than they had in months. Not because everything was better, but because I had started telling the truth again. At least to myself. I washed the teacup slowly, letting the water run warm over my skin. Steam curling up like a benediction. I didn't need anyone to notice. Not tonight. Because tonight, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like room. Room to breathe. Room to begin again. And maybe, just maybe, room to grow into the woman I had quietly been, all along. And, have you ever felt yourself disappearing, and then decided to come back anyway? If so, your story belongs here too. We invite you to share it. Some returns don't need an announcement. Just a gentle turning of the page. Subscribe to Kamar FM, where every story is a second chance. The next morning, I woke before anyone else. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. That was new. I wrapped my shawl tight. And stepped into the hallway. Barefoot, careful not to wake the floorboards. In the kitchen, the light was soft. Muted. A pale hush that came through the blinds. Like the world hadn't made up its mind yet. About who I was allowed to be. I opened the drawer beneath the microwave. The one where I kept the little things they hadn't noticed. I still used. A pencil, a pair of reading glasses. An envelope with a phone number I hadn't dialed in years. Inside that envelope, the rental agreement for the Blue Ridge cabin. Still folded. Still signed. I smoothed it across the table. Ran my hand down the centerfold. The paper had yellowed slightly. At the creases. But it was intact. Just like me. Harold and I had planned to spend our last chapter there. We'd never made it. Life had gotten busy. Then he got sick. Then the years blurred. But the dream hadn't left. It had simply waited. I pulled out the notebook from last night. Wrote a single line beneath my entry. Call Linda, confirm key still works. Linda was the property manager. A practical woman with a kind voice. She and Harold had exchanged Christmas cards for years. I hadn't spoken to her since the funeral. But I remembered how, at the service, she squeezed my hand and said, "If you ever need a place to breathe, you still have one." I never followed up. I folded the rental paper back into the envelope, tucked it under the tea tin. Then I opened the pantry. Not for ingredients. For inventory. What was mine? What could be packed quietly? What did I want to take not out of spite, but because it still held me? The green teapot. The spice tin. The shawl Harold bought me at the fair in Boone. They were small things. Unimportant to anyone else. But they were mine. I didn't take them yet. I only looked. Touched. Measured what fit in a single bag. And what I could let go of. This wasn't fleeing. It wasn't dramatic. It was something else entirely. The quiet gathering of a woman reclaiming her outline before others finished redrawing it for her. The next day, I walked to the post office. It was only 6 blocks. But I hadn't made the walk alone in months. They always offered to drive me, as if I'd forgotten how to cross a street or read a stoplight. But my legs still worked. So did my mind. I brought the envelope. Not to send. Just to weigh. To feel its size in my coat pocket. As it pressed gently against my hip. A quiet signal that something was moving. Even if no one else could see it. The woman at the counter smiled. She remembered me. "Miss Della," she said, tilting her head. "Been a while." I nodded. "Too long." She asked if I needed anything. I bought a book of stamps. I didn't quite need. Then walked home slower. Then I'd left. I passed the church. The bench where Harold and I once sat. After choir rehearsal. His fingers laced with mine. Like time owed us something. The hardware store. Still smelled of oil and old wood. A bell still jingled when someone came in. Nothing had changed. And somehow, everything had. Back home. I poured a cup of tea. And made a second list. This one on yellow paper. Clean. Practical. 1. Call Linda. 2. Withdraw small cash, not traceable. 3. Pack clothes, only what fits in brown leather satchel. 4. Leave no note. 5. Leave no apology. It wasn't escape. I wasn't running. I was stepping out. Without asking for the spotlight. Because people like me, we aren't expected to leave. We're expected to endure. To sit quietly on the porch. Until the house forgets we ever paid for it. But Harold taught me better. He used to say, "There's a difference between being silent and being silenced." I wrote that on the back of the list. Circled it. Underlined it twice. Then folded the paper and slid it into my notebook. Tucked between the recipes and the letters. The doorbell rang. A neighbor, dropping off a package. I smiled, said thank you. Closed the door without inviting her in. I didn't need interruptions. Not today. In the quiet. I stood in the center of the kitchen. Turned in a slow circle. I looked at the walls. The light. The chair Harold built. And I thought, this isn't a goodbye. This is a return. Not to a place, but to myself. By Thursday, I had everything I needed. Not much. Just enough. The satchel sat beneath my bed. Worn leather, soft at the corners. It held 2 cardigans, 3 dresses. Harold's photo in its silver frame. A small pouch of dried rosemary. And my mother's rosary. Wrapped in a handkerchief. No papers. No farewell note. I wanted no ceremony. Only motion. Each morning, I practiced small things. Closing the door without a sound. Walking down the front steps without creaking. Waiting until their car left the driveway. Before I brewed my tea. It wasn't fear that guided me. It was reverence. For my own decision. For the silence that had shaped me. And was now shaping something else. Freedom doesn't always arrive with a suitcase at midnight. Sometimes, it comes in the form of knowing exactly where you placed your keys. I found mine. The spare for the cabin. Inside the sewing tin. Still wrapped in blue velvet. I hadn't touched it in 15 years. And yet, when I held it, it was as if time folded in and placed Harold's hand around mine again. "You'll know when," he once told me. And now, I did. I checked the weather. Clear skies for Sunday. They'd be at church. The service would run long. Brunch afterward. They always took their time. That would be enough. I wouldn't leave a gap. Only quiet. No drama. No confrontation. Just absence. Arranged carefully. Like flowers pressed between the pages of an old book. Still there. Still intact. But no longer needed in the vase. I wrote a final line in the notebook. Pack warmth, not explanation. Then, I turned the page. Left it blank. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because the next part wasn't meant to be written down just yet. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of broth. The moon was high, the wind gentle. I could hear them laughing in the next room. Something about a show I no longer followed. I didn't mind. I let their voices drift. Let the distance rest easy between us. And I thought to myself, softly, without malice, if silence was the only thing they ever gave me freely, then maybe it was the only thing I'd take with me. When I finally walked away, the house was quiet. Not the uneasy kind. The kind that waits. Sunday morning. Their voices echoed faintly down the stairs. Choir music, the soft tap of heels. Keys jingling in practiced rhythm. They left without checking on me. It wasn't unusual. She likes to sleep in on Sundays. I once heard my son say, "She's earned it." They didn't know. I'd already been awake for 2 hours. Fully dressed. Tea sipped. Satchel zipped. I waited until the sound of the garage door had faded down the hill. Then I stood. No shaking. No second thoughts. Just breath. And movement. I walked through each room slowly. Like saying goodbye to a house that had already let go of me, long before I chose to leave it. The living room smelled of lavender spray. The couch was still marked by the faint indent of where I used to sit, before they brought in a new throw pillow and told me it was better for posture to move to the armchair in the corner. I touched the frame of Harold's photo, not to take it, just to acknowledge it. Then moved to the kitchen. The kettle was still warm from their tea. I poured the last bit into my cup, drank it standing. No rush. No fear. Only the sense that time was holding its breath with me. In the hallway, I left one thing behind. A crocheted square. Sun faded, frayed at the edges. It had once covered the back of my favorite chair. I placed it gently on the kitchen table. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a warning. It was a thread. A soft echo of what used to be home. For someone who had simply grown too quiet to fight for it. I stepped outside. Locked the door behind me. The key turned easily. Like the house accepted it. I didn't glance back. I walked slowly to the bus stop. Sat beneath the maple tree that Harold planted in 1991. After his mother died. He said grief was better when rooted in something living. The bus pulled up. Empty, except for the driver. He nodded at me. Didn't ask questions. I climbed aboard. Sat near the window. Placed my bag at my feet. And as we pulled away, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph. Not defiance. Just room. Enough room to belong again, even if only to myself. They returned just after noon. The garage door groaned open. Footsteps. Laughter. Plastic bags rustled. Brunch leftovers. A bouquet maybe for show. I imagined them stepping into the kitchen, placing things on the counter, still wearing their Sunday smiles. It probably took them a while to realize something was different. Maybe it was the folded crocheted cloth on the table. Maybe it was the silence that felt too complete. Or maybe it was just the absence of interruption. She called out first. "Mom?" A pause. Then again. Louder. "Della?" The house didn't answer. Neither did I. Drawers opened. A few hurried steps across the floor. A bedroom door creaked. Then another. I imagined them checking the guest room. Still made up. My shoes gone. Closet half empty. The medicine organizer missing from the shelf. And still, no note. No message. Only presents removed. Without permission. It wasn't rage that filled the rooms. It was confusion. That particular kind of confusion. That only exists when you never imagined someone would choose themselves over staying. I don't know who found the envelope. It wasn't addressed. It wasn't even sealed. Just resting beside the empty teacup in the sink, holding one thing: the deed. Still in my name. Still valid. Nothing crossed out. Nothing signed over. No instructions. No apology. Only a line scribbled at the bottom. In my handwriting. I kept the silence. You rewrote the story. The rest was blank. I left no list. No callback number. I didn't need them to follow. Didn't need them to explain. What had been taken from me wasn't property. It was place. And that I had taken back. Not through lawyers. Not through threats. Just by leaving. By reminding them that presence is not owed. That showing up was never the same as being seen. And that quiet can be an exit sign, just as much as a welcome mat. I imagine my son sat down after that. Maybe with his head in his hands. Maybe staring at the wall where my photo used to be. And in that long, unfolding quiet, I wonder if he finally heard what I never said. That absence, when chosen, echoes louder than presence. Taken for granted. The road to Blue Ridge curled like ribbon, through pockets of sun and shadow. I hadn't been up here in years, but my body remembered. Every curve. Every rusted fence post. Every hollow where wildflowers once gathered. Like they were waiting for someone to notice. The bus let me off at a gravel turn. No signs. No voices. Just air that smelled of pine. And last night's rain. I walked the last half mile. The satchel wasn't heavy. Not anymore. Each step was lighter than the last one I took in that house. The cabin sat where we left it. Small, upright, weathered around the eaves, but still holding its own against the hill. The key slid into the lock, without resistance, like it had been waiting for my hand. Inside, dust motes danced in the late afternoon light. The curtains hung soft and pale, just as Harold had picked them. The quilts still folded over the arm of the chair. The one we said we'd fight over. When we turned 80. I laughed. Not out loud. Just in that quiet way. Your chest moves. When memory softens grief into something warm. The kettle still worked. I filled it from the sink. Set it on the stove. Lit the flame. The sound of the water heating was the only thing that moved. And yet, everything inside me was settling. I unpacked slowly. The photo of Harold went on the mantel. The rosemary pouch, tucked near the window. No television. No schedule. Just a small table. A pen. And a notebook. With space to begin again. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't need to. What I felt was clear. Like the click of a door that finally closes. After years of being left ajar. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. The trees responded. Not with resistance, but with rhythm. They didn't need to be told what to do. Neither did I. I poured the tea, held the cup in both hands. Let the steam curl up into my face. Like a blessing. And I thought, they may never understand why I left. They may never ask. But I didn't need them to. Not anymore. Because I didn't leave to make a point. I left to make space. And I had. Some stories aren't about revenge. They're about return. Not to who you were, but to who you never stopped being. The mornings were different now. Not quieter, but kinder. I woke with the sun filtering through linen curtains. A softness to the light that made it feel less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something gentle. No footsteps above my head. No doors shutting down the hall. Just birdsong and the slow creak of floorboards that had held no one's weight in too long. I moved differently here. Not rushed. Not careful. Just present. Each movement had its own rhythm. The way I stirred the oats on the stove. The way I folded the wool shawl over the back of the chair. The way I opened the front door. Not to look for someone, but to greet the day. The porch swing was still there. Dusty, but intact. I wiped it down with a wet rag. And sat in it with my tea. Letting it sway gently. Under the weight of return. The view hadn't changed much. Pine trees stretched upward. As if nothing had ever told them not to. Blue Ridge rolled in the distance. Calm and unbothered. The world had never stopped. I had simply stepped out of it. For a while. Now I was stepping back in. Not loudly. Not with ceremony. But with breath. Inside. I unpacked the last box. Notebooks. Letters. One old church cookbook. With my name handwritten on page 112. Next to a peach cobbler recipe. I hadn't made in 20 years. I left it on the table. Open to that page. Maybe I'd make it again. Maybe I wouldn't. But the fact that I could meant more than anything. I spent that afternoon in the garden. Most of it had gone to seed. But a few things were hanging on. A line of mint by the back steps. Some thyme that had grown wild. And a single tomato plant. Its fruit small, blushed with stubbornness. I clipped what I could. Rinsed it in the sink. Patted it dry with the hem of my apron. There was no rush. No one to feed but me. But I wanted the house to smell like something. Not just survival. Memory. So I made soup. The kind Harold used to call real food for real weather. Carrots. Broth. The rosemary I'd kept in my bag. I ate it at the table. With both hands wrapped around the bowl. Let the heat move through me. Like something earned. And I thought. This is what presence feels like. When no one is asking you to prove it. Not earned through labor. Not bought through silence. Just allowed. I wrote in my notebook again that night. Not long entries. Just moments. Wind in the chimes at 3:12 p.m. First mint picked. Didn't think about what I used to be. The pages were filling slowly. Not with what I'd lost, but with what I was beginning to keep. And for the first time in years, the story I was living. I was one I didn't have to rewrite. Just to survive it. That weekend, a letter came. No return address. Just my name. Written in my son's handwriting. I let it sit on the counter for a full day. Before opening it. Inside. 2 lines. We didn't know you'd leave. We hope you're okay. There was no anger. No apology. Just wait. Like they were writing into a silence. They never expected to be left with. I folded the letter. And placed it between 2 pages in my notebook. Didn't cry. Didn't write back. Some things don't need an answer. Just a space to land. Later that evening, I lit a candle. The beeswax kind. That Harold used to buy from the co-op. Its scent filled the cabin slowly. Not overpowering. Just enough to remind the room that something was alive and burning. And choosing to stay. I sat by the window. With a blanket around my shoulders. And watched dusk settle into the trees. The wind moved gently through the pines. No drama. No thunder. Just rustling. Like the earth exhaling something. It had held too long. I didn't need much anymore. But I had made something here. A rhythm. A space. A life. It wasn't built from what I'd been given. It was built from what I chose to keep. A single shelf with 3 cookbooks. A basket with my yarn, finally touched again. A ceramic mug that didn't match any set. But fit perfectly in my hands. This, I realized, was my legacy. Not what I left behind, but what I carried forward. When no one thought I still could. Peace doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes quietly. Like a woman unlocking her own front door. With no one watching. And no need to explain why. It takes root. In silence that no longer hurts. in choices that don't need approval, in mornings that belong only to you. That night, I sat at the table with a clean sheet of paper. Wrote, to my granddaughter, if you ever wonder where your voice comes from, it's from women who once whispered to survive, and then remembered how to speak. I folded the page, tucked it inside a book of poetry, marked it with a sprig of dried rosemary. No fanfare. No grand gesture. Just a quiet offering, left where it could be found when the time was right. Outside, an owl called once. The wind shifted, and I sat very still, not waiting anymore, just being. Have you ever walked away? Not to escape, but to return to yourself? If this story felt like yours, in echoes, in pieces, in pauses, we invite you to leave something behind here. A sentence. A memory. A silence you finally named. Because justice can be quiet, but it is never weak. You are not alone. We invite you to share your story below. Subscribe to Kamar FM, where every story is a second chance.